What's up everyone, Findeisen here from Holistic Songwriting, and welcome to Me versus the Internet, where we take a look at some big questions in songwriting and we take a look at your answers. So last week, I asked you guys, what is more important, songwriting or sound? If you had to pick one, which of those two would you pick? And I've gotten some really interesting comments here. Now before we get into it, let me just repeat my stance on this. Obviously, I'm a songwriter, so for me, the writing is more important. That's something I pay a lot of attention to. But I also recognize that in today's charts, the percentages are a little bit different. And so I'm thinking typically a more modern pop song is maybe 60-40 sound versus the writing. And maybe I might even go as far as saying it's 70-30 right now. I'm also going to go on record and say that none of these two approaches is any more sophisticated, less difficult, more creative or anything like that. I think both of them are very valuable approaches to making music. Whether you're a sound-based person or a writing-based person. I have a couple of friends that I consider very, very smart, that it's like a religion to them. You know, sound is, it's incredible listening to these people talk. The way they think about sound is really eye-opening and ear-opening for me. The first comment comes to us from Peasant. He says, in my opinion, it's shit in, shit out. When you write bad songs, then a good sound/production doesn't help much. It will still be shit, just hidden under gold paint. And that's actually the case in many modern pop songs. Very boring chord progressions, simplistic lyrics, but good production and arrangements. That doesn't mean that sound isn't important. This brings up an interesting discussion here, actually. Do we listen to music because we want to have an intellectual, cerebral kind of experience, or are we listening for ear candy? Is it something more physical? Is it less emotional maybe, where we're thinking about the story, about the person behind the music? Or is it really something where it's about treating ourselves with interesting sounds, interesting frequencies that we like? It's an interesting question. Our next comment comes to us from M. Tilla, who says, songwriting is more important than sound. Often a well-written song is still good with a cheaper sound. Sound can only make a song better. And that is an interesting comment, because it brings up the question, well, what does it mean to have a good song? What does it mean to make a song better, right? From a statistical point of view, I think it makes sense to say that the more people like your song, the better the song is, right? And obviously you have to separate it out into different niches. But if we look at it from a statistical approach, then I think it makes sense to say that whatever is ranking high in the charts on the billboards, that is typically the songs that a lot of people like. And so those, typically we can say those are great songs in that regard, at least. And hopefully we can come to an agreement here, at least, that those are agreeable songs that at least the average of person is gonna like at least a little bit. So what I find interesting is that people freak out over these ear candy kind of songs or pieces of music. I'm thinking of the Inception theme by Hans Zimmer, which I think is a phenomenal piece of work. But the writing behind it is very, very, very slim. And I don't think Hans Zimmer would disagree with that, coincidentally. Because it is a sound design piece, right? The whole thing was structured around the design of those different sounds of the cello, of those synthesizers that are all beautifully interweaving with another, the production of that, the mixing, the sound design of the synthesizers, all of that, how that comes together is the great part about that theme. A lot of people freak out about that. A lot of people really love that theme. But the writing behind it is really essentially almost none. It's very, very little writing, and the whole thing is almost a loop. So let's move on to the next comment here. Matthew Metz says, think of any classical rock song that has lasted for decades. Bohemian Rhapsody comes to mind, or even art music that has lasted for centuries. Bach, Beethoven, etc. So the point here is, think of all those went down in history, and those were all considered great writers, right? Well, that is true. We have a similar comment here from Colin Freakwave about the Rolling Stones, who says, much of their early output was shoddily recorded, and yet they topped the charts. The writing is the cake, the sound is icing. A lot of people bring up cakes for some reason. These are still examples from half a century ago, and a lot has happened in this industry, right? And it might be true for country, and again, playing devil's advocate here. It might be true for country music and maybe some genres like folk, but for most other genres, it's no longer enough to just send someone, an artist, a great song that is shoddily recorded. It's just not enough anymore. And it's also not enough to hit the charts on iTunes or the Billboard charts or something like that. It really isn't enough. Even your demos have to sound like finished productions. They have to sound radio ready. So I'm not quite sure about that point of view, about saying like, since it worked 50 years ago or 300 years ago, that should still work today. Is I think a lot has changed with Spotify and the internet. So Jack Zango says, a great song can be played and delivered with just an acoustic guitar and singer. You can then dress it up with all the instrumentation and sound devices that your heart desires. If the song, however, is no good to begin with, no amount of sound design will make that a great song. Well, yes and no. Again, it really depends on the genre here as well, I think. Thinking of Blurred Lines here, for example, which I'm sure you're probably not a fan of, Jack, but Blurred Lines, I think, is a really great song if you're a dancer. If you're not a dancer, it's probably really not your cup of tea. But if you're into dancing and, it's a very physical song that really makes you want to move. And I think it does that really well. But if you listen to just the instruments by themselves, it's a fairly boring kind of song. Like, there's no energy curve. Like, it's almost all the same thing. It's almost a loop, The whole thing is based on really just a groove. And I think you might be able to play that on guitar. I don't think it would catch up. So there. Maltpong says, depends on the genre. If I'm a folk artist, then I would obviously choose the song. As a dance music artist, then the sound. The interesting thing with pop music is it is bang in the middle of the spectrum, but I think overall I would choose songs in terms of pop. A great hook is a great hook, no matter the sound. That's a really great point, bringing up folk versus pop, because I really think, as I said earlier, that genres really have a big influence on how you're going to answer this question. It brought up the idea of the memory of Rebecca Black's Friday, which I think actually has a really great hook, and which is part of the reason why it spread so quickly, just because the song was extremely catchy. The problem with that obviously was the lyrics and the production, and you could argue that it was the image as well, although I'm kind of critical on that part. But what I find is really interesting about that is there is a certain sound threshold that your music has to have for people to really take it seriously. Imagine you had heard that song, Friday by Rebecca Black. She had sung that at like an open night with like a shoddy little guitar and didn't play it very well. You would have thought it was the sweetest thing, right? A lot of people would have clapped, a lot of people would have loved it. She would have won if it was like a contest or something like that, because it would be really sweet, right? Her singing about her week or whatever, about the weekend. It's really, really sweet. But then take that, overproduce it, turn it into a full-blown production, and make a video that looks really professional to at least a normal person, and something changes. It's really weird. It's like this S-curve in sound production. A lot of people are okay with really bad production because then they listen to the song. And they're okay with really great production because then they can listen to the production and the ear candy and all that kind of stuff, and maybe even the song as well. But then there's this gray area in between, the uncanny valley, so to say, and that's where most semi-professional songwriters fall into, and that's the most difficult phase of your career. Or you're going to spend it in that uncanny valley, where you sound almost like the charts, and your songwriting is almost as good as the charts, or maybe it is already at radio ready, but just not quite. And so, for example, with Rebecca Black, I think the production was a major part of why that song got shredded in the press, why people hated it so much, because her vocals, Rebecca Black's vocals, sounded so auto-tuned. It was so clear that effect was being used that a lot of people caught on to that, and typically in pop music, most people don't catch on to that. Most people think that's just there, it's done well, and so you maybe catch on to it, but you don't really mind. With Rebecca Black, it was so overdone that people got really annoyed by it. And so it's in that uncanny valley right between really terrible production and really great production, where it sounds almost like the charts, but not quite. We have one more comment from Antonio Grassa about songwriting. He says, good one. I recently began working in a production studio where I both write and produce music. It is ideal to have both good production and writing, but I'm progressively learning towards this idea. A great song can live without a great production, but a great production won't stand a chance without a great song behind it. Sometimes, like with a lot of electronic music, great productions are great songs. But there has to be some great melodic, harmonic, rhythmic writing behind it, even if it goes without lyrics. Now we're moving on to the sound side of things, because we have a lot of defenders of that as well. Mutatio Aeternum says, if it has complex and interesting songwriting, musicians will listen. But if it sounds cool, people will listen. Very good comment. I have to agree with that, unfortunately. Me being a songwriter, it hurts to say that, but I have to agree with that. The Arrow 44 says, in today's modern music, I truly believe it comes down to sound. Also, I would add a third, probably more important element, which is image. The image of the artist is paramount as people need something to identify with. Someone's been paying attention to the artist series at least. Denny's Lemon Drop says, I believe that in most cases, especially in pop music, sound is the ultimate driver as to what makes songs a hit. It's not particularly difficult to write a pop song, but for that song to work, you need a well-crafted soundscape. That is true, although I would still say writing pop songs is very difficult. Irvin says, the modern commercial music is not about music at all. It's all about the beat, charisma, and appearance. Have to be preferably white, young, and sexy. I would personally argue that the charts are fairly racially diverse, at least black and white, with a lot of hip-hop coming on in the charts. Young and sexy, probably true. Although there's still acts every once in a while, like Adele or Ed Sheeran or maybe Sia that are maybe a little bit older or not, like what you would generally consider as classical beauties or whatever. But generally, I think you're right. Whether or not the music is whether or not it's about the music, that really depends on your definition, I think. I would say personally that I think commercial music has always been about the beat and charisma, but it comes down to personal definitions, I guess. Eduardo Padrino says, as a songwriter, I usually try to put a lot of time on harmony, melody, rhythm, and lyrics to make sure that the piece or song I'm working on is interesting to the listener. But I think that when it comes down to the debate between writing or sound, I think sound should be the primary focal point. No matter how great your writing might be, if it sounds unpleasant to the ear, people will not get to appreciate the effort put behind the songwriting. In fact, it would probably drive listeners away. And I have to agree with that. Ganalan says, I would personally aim more for sound than for writing. Good writing is essential to a good song. However, no matter how good of a song you have, if it sounds terrible, no one will care. Also want to touch on one other example of sound over writing, the human voice. I can sit down and sing along with most of the songs I like. However, because the tone of my voice is terrible, the song sounds awful coming from my voice. Susan Boyle could sing a song just using the root note of a song, and it would sound better than if I hit every note of the songs of the world's greatest sing-along perfectly. Again, this is just my opinion, but I believe great sound can make up for okay writing. I don't think great writing can make up for okay sound. Both being great is obviously the way to go, but if I had to choose, I'd choose sound. That is so true, and a lot of the times I've wondered this very thing on the artist series. With a couple of the artists that I've done, I thought, you know what? They don't really have a certain style of writing. Really, the thing that connects it all is the way they market themselves and their voice or their instrument, For example, Adele, or even going back to someone like Jimi Hendrix, they could almost sing or play anything, and it's always going to sound like them just because they have such a distinct way of performing their music. Peanut Joker says, having a unique sound in music is more important than both songwriting and having a clean, polished sound. Now that is true, being unique is more important than sounding absolutely incredible. But then again, what we consider as okay sounding is, our threshold is very, very high already. So if you listen to a couple of songs on forums on the internet, for example, you will soon find out that it's not that easy to sound both unique and good at the same time. So we have kind of come to accept a certain sound as sounding good or acceptable. Anything that's different or less than that, we typically don't tend to agree with very well. Sarah Owens writes, sound is preferred as the main focus. After all, it is music, not literature. I feel like a sound can move me sometimes more than the simple words within it. It's all about the vibe and feeling you get. Many songs I write have simple little phrases or words that mean something more than writing it very detailed. Now that is also a good point. A lot of artists do write very cringy, cheesy lyrics, but the way they perform it does make it work somehow. There's a couple of artists out there, Ed Sheeran being one, for my taste, super cheesy lyrics. If you read them on a piece of paper or on the internet, super cheesy and makes my insides hurt. But listening to it in a song, I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of works. He can kind of pull that off and it works for him. So super interesting. James E. Sekelski says this. Defining sound, I consider part of the crafting of the song. When writing, I usually have 3 or so reference songs to work with. For instance, I want that bass groove to sound like A, I love the orchestration or additional instruments of B, and I really want it to feel like C, etc. But when you listen to the final track, you won't be able to pick apart those sounds. And I do mean sounds, although I do pick up a bit of the theory of the inspiration as well. Music, as most enjoy it, is immediate and intuitive. The function of the exercise I just mentioned is to find some principles in the sounds of your favorite songs to base your song on. In that, sound is becoming what really differs an artist, even in the way they perform, pronounce certain words. The sound is their identifier, especially to an audience that isn't as aware of their songwriting styles. Nick B says, just look at how many hit songs are written around the same 4 repeating chords. What sets them apart is sound. True, and image as well. Now, this next question is really interesting because it contains a definition of songwriting that I see popping up every now and then that seems to think that songwriting just means writing the lyrics. And to me personally, that is really very far from the truth, because for me, it's just a fifth of the whole picture. So for me, songwriting really is, yes, lyrics, but then it's melody, harmony, rhythm, and also a little bit of arrangement. So these are all five things that I really think about when I'm writing my songs. And it's, the lyrics come in pretty late. So for me, it's a very different experience writing. That I thought was interesting. Let's hear what Monica has to say here. For me, it's sound, because if you're listening to a song in a language you don't know, you can't tell what it's about until you translate the lyrics, but you can enjoy melody and rhythm and emotions. In music, sound is what differs songs from poetry. Good point. Alex Washington commented, songwriting and good sound is a lot like yin and yang. For a very good song, you would need both because a good balance is often important. If I had to decide between the two, I would choose good songwriting because songwriting/lyrics can be important for giving a song its meaningfulness. My answer for this question might change depending on what music genre is being used. Good point. Although I've had very meaningful experiences with songs where I didn't understand the lyrics. Now we have a couple of comments that thought, yeah, really it's both. And clearly that is the right answer. Obviously, you really want both great sound and great songwriting. It wasn't really the question because I asked you to just pick one, but there's still a couple of interesting comments that we got from this. So Richard Bolt says, I see it like a cake, and any comment that starts like this obviously has to go in this video. The actual cake is the writing, the frosting is the sound. That's why you can make different flavored stuff with the same cake. A cake without frosting lacks any flavor and is bland, while frosting lacking a cake won't have much sustenance. You're going to need both, or else you'll be deficient in one way or another. That's a good comment and also makes me hungry. William Lebrecht says, I think sound is important for marketing and writing is important for image. Sound is how you meet someone, is when you first meet someone, it's the first contact you have with someone, and the songwriting is the personality when you get to know the person. Can we agree on that? Love it. Jean Lejeune says, my dad had this Motown box set. He gave me a copy, of course, you knew I was a big fan. On the last disc, it had remakes of some of the classic hits by the original artists, but recorded in a modern studio. We both couldn't get into these because it didn't have that sound. However, if the writing isn't any good, no one's gonna listen. Gotta have both. Samuel Feinstein says, I don't think one exists without the other. Great writing with shit sound isn't a song, it's an idea. Great sound won't actually sound great without great writing to back it up. Jason Quinlan says, this is a tough one. Sound and sound quality is extremely important nowadays. If you listen to older albums like Bleach by Nirvana, some may not sound as produced or as crisp as some today, but the great songwriting still shines through. By the way, I would argue that Bleach by Nirvana was actually really well done because it really captured that soul that grunge had, this new style had. But he goes on to say, sound is extremely important, but if the writing is bad, the song will fall short no matter how crisp or clear it sounds. I think sound is the second half of creating a song, first being songwriting, but saying that, personally I think songwriting and sound is something you must balance and try to develop both as much as you can. So this guy says, I cannot separate the two. When I write, I always think of sound. There are a couple that I refuse to divorce. There are lyrics and phrases that I write with the intent to add lush harmonies too. Equally so, if it is that they be separate, I want them to work well on their own with the idea that they will always be best together. That's beautiful, right? So that's it, folks. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for your comments. And also, if you're interested in developing your own sound and becoming a producer yourself and maybe being in charge of your own sound, then I have something really interesting for you, because this Saturday I'm releasing a new course on producing for people like you that don't have the technical know-how and don't know how to do all of that. And understand that. I was there too. I found it very difficult in the beginning, but I can show you how to do all of that without becoming a complete computer geek, because I'm not. I'm a writer. I'm a creative person first and foremost, and not a geek. So not that being a geek is a bad thing, but you know, it requires a lot of work, and I would much rather spend that time writing. So if you're like me, if you would like to learn how to produce your own songs and be in charge of your own sound, then watch out for a video that I'm going to release on Saturday, which is going to take you to that course. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. And stay fertig.